She had attended her husband's funeral with a loaded derringer hidden in her corset and a dead man's confession sewn into the lining of her grief coat. Nobody standing at that graveside knew any of it. They saw only the widow. They saw a woman composed and black-veiled and appropriately still while the minister read scripture over a man who had not died of cardiac arrest at all, regardless of what the death certificate said. They saw exactly what a grieving widow in Abilene, Kansas in the spring of 1879 was supposed to look like, and they were satisfied with the seeing because satisfaction was easier than looking closer. They did not see her watching Judge Harmon Alcott across that open grave. They did not see the way he wept with the precision of a man who had rehearsed weeping, who had calculated exactly how much moisture genuine grief required, and had produced that precise amount, not a tear more, not a trace less. They did not see her understand in the cold and final way that certain understandings arrive, that she was looking at the man who had ordered her husband killed, and that she was next. The understanding arrived quietly the way the worst things do, not as a thunderclap, but as a settling, the specific gravity of a truth that has been circling for weeks finally landing where it was always going to land. She stood in the April sun, with the Kansas wind moving her veil and her hand pressed flat against the iron box hidden beneath her traveling coat, and she looked at Harmon Alcott across the open grave of the man who had been her husband for 3 years, and thought, I know what you did, and you know that I know, and this is the last time in your life that you will underestimate me. She had left Abilene on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks later with $418 sewn flat against her ribs and a battered iron dispatch box under her arm. She had been running for 5 months after that. She had answered 7 matrimonial advertisements in newspapers from Kansas to New Mexico territory before she answered the one from Cimarron Ridge, and even then she had not written back. She had simply bought a ticket. She was done waiting to be found. Now, 40 miles from Red Rock Crossing, the flat brown certainty of Kansas dissolving into something older and stranger behind the train window. Nora Calloway, she had been using her mother's maiden name since Topeka, pressed her hand against the iron box in her lap and tried for the first time in 7 months to simply breathe. The box had been pressed into her hands on a Tuesday morning in March. Daniel had come home at 7:30 with his collar undone and blood on his cuff and a look in his eyes she had never once seen in 3 years of marriage. Not love. She had come to understand gradually, and then all at once, that what she had mistaken for love in Daniel Calloway was something closer to appreciation for a useful and decorative object. Not regret exactly, though. Regret was somewhere in the look. The expression was something she had no word for until later when she had enough distance to name it properly. It was the look of a man who has finally understood what he has done, who has run the full accounting and arrived at the sum and found he cannot live with it. Keep it hidden, he had said. His voice was not steady, and Daniel Calloway was always steady. It was one of the things she had admired about him before she understood that steadiness and honesty were not the same quality in a man. Everything is in there. Everything I found. Don't let Silas anywhere near it. Silas, his brother-in-law. Judge Silas Morrow of the Missouri Circuit Court, a man whose name adorned charitable endowments and civic halls and the dedications of 2 Abilene churches. A man of grave courtesy and silver hair and impeccable boots who had, over the previous 11 years, stolen $380,000 from the Frontier Public Land Trust, and who had then arranged with the patient thoroughness of a man who had never once been caught at anything for every person who knew about it to become very quietly unavailable. Daniel had known. Daniel had become unavailable in April. The official verdict was cardiac arrest. He had been 41 years old and in excellent health, but men died of cardiac arrest, and Silas had wept at the graveside with mathematical precision, and no one had questioned anything. And Nora had stood in her black dress with her hand pressed against the lining of her traveling coat, and understood with the cold and specific clarity of a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose exactly what she was dealing with. She had opened the box that night. She had read every document inside by candlelight in a locked room with a chair jammed under the doorknob and her derringer on the nightstand within reach, and she had read until 3 in the morning, and then she had sat in the silence of the fine Abilene house she would never return to and thought carefully about what she was going to do. She had started packing at dawn. By the time Silas's first investigator appeared on her street, a medium-height man in a tan coat who did not look at her house quite long enough to be obvious. She was gone. She had been moving ever since. Kansas City, Topeka, Dodge City, always west, always ahead of the man in the tan coat and whoever came after him. She had stood on the Dodge City platform 3 weeks ago with two men in dark suits trying to take the box from her by brute force, one large as a barn door and one soft-faced with the particular smile of a man paid to frighten women into compliance. And she had looked them both in the eye and said very quietly and very clearly that she would scream until every conductor, porter, and passenger on the Kansas Pacific Railroad heard her before she surrendered a single inch of ground. They had retreated. The train had left. And now she was 40 miles from a ranch she had never seen belonging to a man she had never met. And she had a box full of evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful judges in 4 territories. And she had no plan beyond get there and breathe and figure out what comes next. It was not her finest plan. It was the only one she had. Her name had been Nora Vogel, daughter of a German land surveyor from Salina, who had taught her to read survey maps before she could properly read novels, who had considered precision a form of respect and imprecision a form of dishonesty, who had died of a fever when she was 19 and left her the surveying shorthand he'd invented, and the understanding that the most useful knowledge is the kind that belongs only to you until you choose to share it. It had become Nora Calloway on a June morning 3 years ago when she married Daniel Calloway, Abilene's most admired land attorney, a man of careful eyes and careful words who had spent the better part of their marriage teaching her in small and nearly invisible increments that the world she was permitted to occupy was considerably narrower than the one she had been born into. He had called her intelligence exceptional and then spent 3 years routing it into uses he approved of. He had called her composure remarkable and then spent those same 3 years ensuring that composure was deployed in service of his dinner parties. His reputation, his careful navigation of a life that she now understood, had been built on a foundation he had spent years trying not to look at directly. She was 32 years old. She had gray eyes the color of flint that nobody had looked at directly in 3 years. She had $418 in a locked box in a letter from a stranger in New Mexico territory who had written 7 plain paragraphs about why he needed a wife and who had not once mentioned that he required her to be decorative. She had read that letter 6 times on the train out of Dodge City. She could recite it from memory. The Red Rock Crossing advertisement was different from the others in the specific way that honest things are different from dishonest ones. Not more polished, not more persuasive, but more solid. It had weight. Emmett Hale Rancher, New Mexico territory required a wife not for sentiment and not for appearances, but for practical reasons he was willing to state plainly. 60 acres along the Cimarron Ridge with a water rights dispute, bleeding him dry for 9 years. A daughter of 11 who needed a capable adult woman in her life. A ranch operation that needed someone who could read a legal document and make a decision without requiring the frontier to resemble the illustrations in Harper's Weekly. He offered honesty, a fair arrangement, and the acknowledgement, plainly stated without apology, that he was not a young man with romantic prospects and had no promises to offer that he did not intend to keep. No promises he did not intend to keep. She had read that line 4 times separately from the rest. She had not written back. She had bought a ticket. The difference mattered to her in a way she could not fully articulate, but felt in the specific place where 3 years of carefully managed disappointment had left its mark. The train from Dodge City arrived at Sweetgrass Station, New Mexico territory at 10:30 on a Wednesday morning in late October. 35 minutes behind schedule, smelling of coal smoke and collective exhaustion and the particular staleness of people who have been moving for too long. Nora descended to the platform with her carpet bag in one hand and the iron box under her other arm and stood in the October heat and looked up at the largest sky she had ever seen. She had grown up under a Kansas sky. She had thought she understood sky. She was profoundly wrong. This sky did not merely exist above you. It pressed down with a patient, enormous weight, and the earth beneath it. Red rock and silver sage and the distant suggestion of a ridge running north like the spine of something very old and very still, answered the sky with its own kind of patience. It was a landscape that had existed before every person alive and would exist long after all of them. And standing beneath it, she felt something she had not felt in 7 months. Not safety. She was not foolish enough to call it safety. She felt room. A boy of perhaps 12 was asleep against a water barrel outside the station, hat tipped forward over his face against the October sun. Nora stopped in front of him. "You know a man named Emmett Hale?" He pushed his hat back and looked at her with the frank, comprehensive inventory of the very young. Everybody knows Mr. Hale. How do I reach his property? 4 miles north up toward the ridge. He squinted at the iron box under her arm. You the woman he sent for. The heat came into her face before she could prevent it. She had not calculated for how quickly a town of 400 people would assemble that particular fact from whatever scattered evidence was available. She had underestimated the speed by several days. I'm Nora Calloway, she said, which she intended as a complete answer. It seemed to satisfy him. He pointed her toward the livery. She walked with her back straight and her eyes forward, and she did not look about her in the manner of a woman afraid of being watched. She had been that woman for a year. She had moved through the rooms of a fine Abilene house, with her gaze cast down and her voice kept carefully at the register Daniel preferred, and she had told herself this was reasonable, and this was simply how things were, and this was what marriage required. She was done with that. She had burned through done with it somewhere around the 5th state line. The liveryman was a broad, sun-darkened man named Okafor, who had the manner of someone who observed everything and commented on nothing useful. He quoted honest prices and produced no words beyond what was necessary and had her rolling north within 20 minutes. She sat on the wagon bench and watched the town fall away behind her and thought about the arithmetic of the past 7 months, what they had cost her and what they had given her, and whether those two accounts would ever come close to balancing. The land shifted as they moved north. The flat shelf of the town gave way to rising country. Juniper on the slopes, pale outcroppings of sandstone dry creek beds threading between rises of red earth. The sky kept opening. The mesa to the northwest caught the morning light and held it burning orange along its top edge. She had not been prepared for any of this. She had prepared herself carefully for a great many things. She had not prepared for the way this country made her own urgency feel proportionate rather than overwhelming. The way pain feels manageable after you have lived with it long enough to understand its shape. She did not find this comforting exactly. She found it clarifying. They came over a low rise and the Hale property opened below her, a main house of adobe and rough timber, a barn with a recently repaired roof, 2 outbuildings set at practical angles, a windmill turning slow in the breeze, a corral with horses moving in the morning light. Not a large operation. Not a prosperous one by Eastern standards, but solid in the way of a thing built by someone who expected it to endure. The mended fencing tight and true, the yard swept clean, the windmill maintained and functional rather than rusting and forgotten. She had lived in a house with 4 sitting rooms and a formal dining table that seated 20. This was nothing like that house. She found this against all expectation a relief so acute it embarrassed her. Okafor drew up at the gate. She thanked him, paid what he'd asked, and climbed down with her carpet bag and the iron box. She was halfway across the yard when the front door opened. The woman who appeared was not Emmett Hale. She was perhaps 40, dark-haired and handsome, in the capable, health-made way of women who do not rely on fragility for their effect. She wore an apron over a calico dress and held a dish towel, and she looked at Nora with an expression assembled with considerable care. Precisely 1 degree too controlled to be entirely welcoming and considerably too composed to be entirely at ease. Mrs. Calloway, the woman said. Nora did not slow her step. Yes, I'm looking for Mr. Hale. He's out with the stock. The woman's voice was measured, rehearsed, the voice of someone who had decided exactly how to play this and had been playing it since before the wagon came over the rise. I'm Delia Marsh. I help out here. A pause. 1 beat too long. Please come in. You've had a long journey. Nora came in. The interior of the house told her everything she needed to know within the first 10 seconds. The curtains had been pressed, recently and with more care than utility required. A jar of dried wildflowers occupied the windowsill. The kitchen carried the slow herb smell of something that had been simmering since morning, the particular, deliberate domesticity of a woman who has made herself at home in a house that is not officially hers, who has been converting it gradually and purposefully toward her own design for it. A woman at a station in Dodge City had told Nora, with the generous, sharp-edged relish of someone handing you something pointed, that Emmett Hale had been keeping steady company with a widow named Delia Marsh for the better part of a year, ever since her husband's death had left her alone with a farm she couldn't manage, and a town full of people who felt sorry for her. Nora had thanked her pleasantly and filed the information in the place where she kept things requiring careful consideration later. She was considering it now, sitting at Delia Marsh's kitchen table, drinking Delia Marsh's coffee, saying the correct things at the correct intervals, with the smooth, practiced ease of a woman who had spent 3 years performing gracious company for men who found her decorative. Delia was not hostile. Nora had steeled herself for hostility and found instead something considerably more complex, a woman managing herself with visible precision, performing a role she understood was slipping from her, doing it with enough dignity to be genuinely admirable, and enough strain beneath the composure to make witnessing it something close to painful. She was not a petty woman. She was not a cruel one. She was a woman who had built something and was watching someone else walk through the door, and she was handling it better than most would have. Nora respected this. She also had no intention of leaving. Emmett Hale was not what his letter had prepared her for. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the porch, the particular unhurried rhythm of a man who does not rush on his own property, because this is his property, and there is no one he needs to perform urgency for. Then the door opened. The letter had given her facts. 44 years old, rancher widower, one daughter, came west after the war. She had assembled a rough picture from those facts. She had expected weathered and taciturn, probably closed off in the particular way of men who have taken too many losses too close together and organized their remaining interior life around things incapable of leaving. Work, land, the predictable demands of animals and seasons. He was all of those things. He was also a man whose face showed the precise, specific damage of a long loneliness. Not the soft damage of self-pity, but the harder kind, the compression that comes from a man who has stopped expecting much from people and has built his entire remaining life around things that cannot disappoint him. He was tall, lean in the way labor rather than fashion creates. Dark hair, heavily threaded with silver at the temples, hands calloused and very still at his sides. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at her. The first thing she could clearly read on his face was not welcome. It was guilt. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Hale." She rose because she was not going to have this first conversation from a seated position. "Thank you for the invitation." Something moved across his face. He took off his hat, turned it once in his hands in the manner of a man who needs something to do with his hands, while he is deciding how to say something difficult. He looked at her the way almost no one had looked at her in 3 years, with genuine attention, measuring her actual dimensions rather than the dimensions of his assumptions about her. "How was the journey?" he said. "Long," she said. "But I'm here now." Delia set a third cup on the table and excused herself with smooth efficiency, disappearing toward the back of the house with the practiced grace of a woman who knows precisely the moment to remove herself from a scene. Emmett sat across from Nora. He put his hat on the table between them. Neither of them reached for their coffee. "I owe you a straight conversation," he said. "Not an apology, a statement of what was simply factually owed." "I believe you do," she agreed. He assembled his words with the deliberate care of a man accustomed to the concrete language of cattle and fence lines who is now being required to speak in a register that has no clean edges. "Delia Marsh has been a considerable help to me since her husband passed," he said. "She's become accustomed to how things run here." "And to you," Nora said. He met her eyes and did not flinch from them. "Yes." "And the town has formed impressions." "Yes." She picked up her coffee. It was strong, stronger than she preferred, which was already information she was filing away. "What do you want to do?" she asked. The question visibly surprised him. She was beginning to understand a man not often asked what he wanted. Men like him were asked what they had, what they needed, what they planned, not what they wanted. It had been that way long enough that the question itself had become disorienting. "I wanted a mother for my daughter," he said after a pause that lasted long enough to be honest. "Someone steady, someone who'd be here." He looked at his hat on the table. "What I wrote in that advertisement was the truth. What this ranch needs is the truth. I won't pretend I've managed the situation with Delia well." "Nothing useful comes from pretending," she said. "No." His eyes moved briefly to the iron box in her lap, and then with deliberate courtesy away. "That looks heavy." "It is," she said. She did not explain further. He did not press. They sat in the October afternoon light in Delia Marsh's kitchen. Nora was already thinking of it that way, which was both tactical and accurate. And they took each other's measure the way two people do who are both practiced at measuring and have now been asked to measure each other. "I'd like to meet your daughter," Nora said. Something eased in his expression, just fractionally, just enough to be visible. "She'll be back from the schoolhouse by 4, he said. "It's a short ride if you'd like to come." "Good." She rose, picked up her bags. "I'll need a room, not the largest, whichever is available." He stood. "There's one at the end of the hall, east-facing, small." "Small is fine," she said. "I don't require much space." This was not entirely true, but she said it with the conviction of a woman who has learned that the ground you claim in the first hour is the ground you stand on afterward. The room was spare. A narrow bed, a blue quilt worn smooth at the edges, a window looking out over the corral and the windmill, and beyond those the rise of the Cimarron Ridge going dark as the afternoon thinned. Someone, she suspected Delia, had placed a sprig of dried sage in a small glass jar on the sill. She could not determine whether this was a gesture of welcome or a territorial claim, and she supposed it didn't much matter which. She set the iron box on the floor beside the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed one hand against the lining of her riding coat where $418 had been sewn flat and careful against her ribs for 7 months. She was not safe. She had purchased time and distance and a room that faced east. But she was not safe. Out in the kitchen, she could hear Delia moving with the quiet competence of a woman who believed this was her house. Nora understood that belief from the inside. She had once believed she was safe in a fine Abilene house because a man with careful eyes had given her roses every Sunday, and then with equal care had taken everything else. She was not going to make that mistake again. She was also not going to be crowded out of a room she had been invited into. She rose, smoothed her skirt, opened her door. In the kitchen, Emmett was speaking quietly to Delia near the stove. They stood close in the unconscious way of people who have grown accustomed to each other's physical proximity. Not romantic exactly, but the intimate ease of shared daily life. The ease of two people who have stopped editing themselves in each other's presence. When Nora appeared in the doorway, both of them looked up. Delia went carefully neutral. Emmett went to something she could not yet name. "I thought I'd help with supper," Nora said pleasantly. "If there's anything wanting attention." "I've got it well in hand," Delia said. "I'm sure you do." Nora pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table as though the chair had been waiting for her specifically. "I'll keep you company then. I've been sitting on trains for 4 days and the kitchen smells wonderful." She sat there. She did not leave. After a moment, Delia turned back to the stove. There was a bowl of dried beans on the table. Nora pulled it toward her, found the paring knife beside it, and began sorting through them with the precise, efficient movements of a woman who has done 10,000 small domestic tasks without once being thanked for a single one. She did not look at Emmett. She did not need to. She could feel the room recalibrating itself around her. 3 people adjusting to a new arrangement, testing the new weights and distances, deciding what the situation was going to require of each of them going forward. She had survived harder calibrations. Clara arrived at 4:20, carried home in a neighbor's wagon, and appeared in the doorway with her school bag and her lunch pail and a face that contained the entire apparatus of a thorough and entirely honest assessment. Nora understood immediately that this was the person whose verdict actually mattered in the Hale household. The girl looked at her the way very intelligent children look at unexpected things, not with hostility, but with the frank evaluation of someone who has not yet been taught that frank scrutiny is impolite and who would not likely follow that instruction even if it were given. She was dark-haired like her father with a serious face and a jaw set with inherited stubbornness. 11 years old and already carrying the particular gravity of a child who has known loss and has organized her entire self around it. "You're the lady from the advertisement," Clara said. "I am," Nora said. "Nora Calloway. It's good to meet you." "Papa says you're from Abilene." "I am." "He says your father was a land surveyor." "He was." Clara absorbed this with the gravity it apparently warranted. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Mrs. Marsh can't," Clara said with the calm neutrality of a child reporting a weather observation. "She says horses are unpredictable." From across the room, Nora felt Delia elect not to respond to this. "Horses are reasonable animals," Nora said, "if you understand how they're thinking." Clara held her gaze another moment, filed something internally, and went to wash her hands with the purposefulness of someone who has made a preliminary judgment and is satisfied enough with it to proceed. Emmett was standing by the far window. When Nora glanced at him, he was watching his daughter with an expression she had not expected, love so unguarded and complete that it had no idea it was showing itself. It sat naked on his face, and he did not know it was not performing, it was not doing anything with it at all. It simply existed. It was simply true. She looked away quickly. It was too direct a thing to look at without feeling something, and she could not afford right now to feel anything she had not planned for. Dinner was an exercise in triangulation. Delia served beautifully and spoke pleasantly and was clearly beloved by Clara in the way children love capable, consistent adults who have been there through the hard times. Emmett said very little, which appeared to be his natural manner rather than a performance of it. Nora listened and observed and said the right things at the right intervals, a skill she had honed over 3 years of Daniel's dinner parties. After dinner, Emmett offered to walk the property before the light was entirely gone. Delia stayed to clear up. Clara announced she was coming in a tone that established clearly this was not a discussion. They walked out into the October evening. Nora, Emmett, Clara, and the sky had gone deep orange and red over the mesa, and the wind had dropped to almost nothing, and the desert held the day's warmth in the earth. The way old stone holds warmth, slowly released long after the source is gone. "The north pasture is the best ground I have," Emmett said, pointing toward the darkening ridge. "Spring water comes down from the upper formation. The problem is that the Faro Land Syndicate has been contesting my rights to the water source for 9 years. There's a survey conflict." He paused. "It's what keeps me up at night." "Do you have the documentation?" she asked. He glanced at her sideways. "Some?" "The original deed, the survey markers, your territorial filing." "Some," said with considerably less confidence. The pause of a man who knows the paperwork is the real problem. "My father spent 20 years in Kansas resolving property disputes," she said. "I learned to read the filings when I was young." He looked at her with a quality of attention that was new, something closer to genuine reassessment. "That's useful," he said. "I have various useful things," she said. Clara had run ahead to check on the horse she favored. They stood in the fading light in a silence that was honest, if not comfortable. "I owe you an apology," Emmett said quietly, "for the situation you walked into. Delia, it's not what it might look like from the outside, but it's also not nothing, and I handled it badly." She turned to look at him. The last light was going, and in the half-dark his face had the same quality as the country itself, formed over a long time by hard things, not by anything gentle. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I'll tell you something true. I didn't come here the way most women answer these arrangements. My reasons were considerably more complicated than loneliness." She paused. "I'll tell you more when I know you better. What I want you to understand tonight is that I have no intention of making your life harder. I intend to make it workable. I am a practical woman and I do not frighten easily." He was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. "Good." She looked toward the dark where Clara had disappeared. "Now let's go collect your daughter before she decides to saddle up in the dark." They walked back toward the lighted windows of the house, and the stars came out above the mesa, enormous and indifferent and startlingly close. And Nora carried the iron box under her arm and her secrets inside her chest, and she thought, "I am alive. I am here. Whatever is coming, I am not waiting for it in Abilene." That night she lay in the east-facing room and listened to the desert, insects and wind and horses shifting in the corral. She thought about Delia Marsh somewhere in this same house managing herself through a situation nobody had prepared her for. She thought about Emmett Hale lying awake at the far end of the hall, which was almost certainly what he was doing. She thought about Clara in her small room, sleeping the organized, compressed sleep of a child who has made what peace she can with what she cannot change. She thought about the iron box on the floor beside the bed. She thought about Judge Silas Morrow in his courtroom in Missouri, his black robe, his composed patience, his absolute certainty that no woman alone with a box of papers could outrun the reach of a man who owned the law in 4 territories. She reached down in the dark and touched the cold iron. Then she closed her eyes. She had $418 in a locked box in a room that faced east. That was enough to begin. But she was wrong about one thing, and she would not know it for another 8 days. She was not as far ahead of Silas Morrow as she believed. He had already sent someone west. In the days following her arrival, Nora committed herself to learning the geography of the Hale household, the way she learned everything that mattered to her in life, by watching carefully before she moved. The house was not large. Adobe walls, small windows, a kitchen that was genuinely the center of everything rather than a room for show. Emmett had built it himself. The original structure in each addition with help from a Mexican carpenter named Tomas, who still came twice a year for the roof work, and who, according to Clara, was the best person in 3 territories at matching adobe color. He had built it after the war in the way certain men respond to catastrophe, not by breaking, but by pressing outward into new territory and making something solid with their hands. She was beginning to understand that this was not incidental to his character. It was his character. He was a man who responded to destruction by building. She found this quietly considerably easier to be near than the alternatives. The water situation was worse than she had initially understood. On her 4th day, while Emmett was mending fence on the north boundary, she spread the survey maps and claim documents across the kitchen table and worked through them with the methodical patience she had inherited from 20 years of watching her father pursue property disputes in Kansas. What she found was there, but quiet. A date discrepancy in the easement filing. A survey marker appearing twice in the territorial register under slightly different coordinates. A marginal notation in the Faro claim written in a different hand from the rest of the document. Someone had added to it after the original filing, and they had not been particularly careful about matching the ink weight. Not proof of fraud, not yet, but a thread. She made her notes in her own hand, refolded the maps along their original creases, and returned everything exactly as she had found it. She had learned the hard way that rushing with threads was how you turned them into knots. The evenings were the strangest part of those first days. After supper, Clara went to her room and Delia departed. There were limits to the arrangement, and nighttime was one of them. And the house found its night configuration Emmett at the far end of the kitchen table, with the ranch accounts or a journal he closed when she approached, and Nora across from him with her own papers or correspondence, or simply nothing, sitting with chamomile tea and the sound of the desert and the lamp burning between them. They did not try to fill the silence. They sat in it. The silence was awkward for the first several evenings, and then became less so, and by the end of the first week, it had settled into simply the particular quality of evenings in this house. 2 people occupying the same space without pretense. She noticed how he looked toward the door when the wind picked up sharply. She noticed he always checked the water barrel before coming inside at night. She noticed the small, barely audible exhale he made when he was working something difficult through in his head. She noticed how he tracked her movements through the house and adjusted his own accordingly, giving her room without ceremony or comment. On the 3rd day, when she came in from the corral with her skirt thoroughly muddied from a horse that had bumped her against the fence rail, he said nothing about the mud, nothing about whether she ought to be in the corral at all, and simply handed her a clean cloth with the matter-of-fact courtesy of a man who considers other people's business to be their own. That was when she began to think this might actually be workable. On the 8th day, the stranger came to town. She almost missed him. She had ridden into Sweetgrass Crossing with Emmett for supplies, her first return to town since arrival. Sitting on the wagon bench in the cool morning, with the iron box between them, watching how the town tracked their arrival, with the small signifying glances of a community processing new information about its members. She was in the general store selecting thread when she saw him through the front window. Medium height, medium build, tan coat, hat angled to shade his face from the October sun. He was standing at the far end of the street examining the notice board, but he wasn't reading. His eyes were quartering the street with the practiced, methodical efficiency of a man paid to find things. Not curious eyes, professional eyes. She had seen him before. Not here, in Abilene. Outside Daniel's office on a Thursday afternoon in August, 3 weeks before Daniel died. She set down the thread with great care and kept her face entirely still. He hadn't seen her yet. He was watching the saloon and the street beyond it with the patience of a man who has learned that waiting is the most reliable form of surveillance. She paid for what was in her basket, walked out, and crossed to where Emmett was loading grain at the wagon. "I need to go back," she said quietly. He looked at her. Something in her face had given something away because his went careful immediately. The specific alertness of a man who reads land and weather and has now started to read her. "All right," he said. No questions, no argument. They were out of town in 10 minutes. She rode beside him in silence for the first mile, and then she said, "I need to tell you something. Not all of it yet, but enough." "Tell me what you need to," he said. She looked straight ahead at the red road unspooling toward the ridge. My husband, Daniel Calloway, died in April, she said. The official verdict was cardiac arrest. She pressed her hand against the iron box in her lap. It wasn't. Emmett said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road. He did not flinch, did not fill the silence, did not reach for any of the easy managing responses that men reach for when women tell them difficult things. He simply waited, and the waiting was its own form of steadiness. Daniel had discovered that money was being diverted from a public land trust, she said. A significant amount, the kind with serious consequences when it goes missing. Before he died, he gave me certain documents, told me to keep them and be careful. She paused. 3 weeks after his death, I opened the box. What was in it, Emmett said. Correspondence, financial records, names. She looked at the mesa. The man responsible for the theft is Daniel's brother-in-law, Judge Silas Morrow of the Missouri Circuit Court. Emmett was quiet long enough that she began to calculate what she would do if he turned the wagon around. And you came here, he said finally, not accusatory, not even surprised, simply naming what was true. I needed to go somewhere Silas wouldn't look immediately, somewhere I had a legitimate reason to be. She kept her voice level. I was not expecting to find a household that needed considerably more than a practical wife. I underestimated what I was walking into. You were running, he said. Yes, she said. Another quarter-mile of silence. She watched the road and calculated. The man in town, Emmett said. A private investigator. I believe Silas hired him. She paused. He may not know exactly where I am yet, but if he's in Sweetgrass, it won't take long. Emmett brought the wagon to a stop on a low rise. Below them, the ranch was visible, small and solid against the red earth. He looked at it for a long moment, then at her. How dangerous is this? He asked. She thought about Silas Morrow, about the way he had stood at Daniel's funeral in his black suit perfectly composed, and looked at her across the open grave with the precise expression of a man registering that she might be a problem. Very, she said. He looked at the ranch again. You should have told me this before you came, he said. Yes, she agreed. I should have. But you didn't because you needed to go somewhere first and decide whether I was someone you could trust. She turned and looked at him. He was still watching the ranch below his face, showing nothing she could name precisely, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Yes, she said. He picked up the reins. He clucked to the horses and they started moving again down toward the buildings and the corral and the windmill turning in the afternoon wind. Is there anything in that box that helps you, he said. Evidence that could actually be used? If it reached the right court, a federal court outside Silas's jurisdiction, yes. How do you get it there? Very carefully, she said. He said nothing more until they reached the barn. When he helped her down from the wagon, the first time he had touched her a brief steadying grip on her arm, he held on 1/fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. Then he released her and led the horses inside without looking back. She stood in the yard and breathed. That evening, after Clara was in bed and Delia had gone home, Emmett came to the kitchen table and sat across from her. He had the iron box in front of him. She had left it in her room. She had been careful with it for 7 months. She looked at it sitting on the table between them and understood with a cold clarity that she had left her door unlocked because she was not yet accustomed to having a door that locked from the outside. I didn't open it, he said. She looked from the box to his face. He met her eyes directly, and his expression was not comfortable. It was the expression of a man confronting something about himself that he did not particularly like confronting. I went to fix the chair in your room, he said. The leg's been loose since July. I picked the box up to move it, and I thought about opening it. He paused. I didn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you told me something hard today, he said. It seemed right to tell you something honest in return. He slid the box toward her side of the table. This arrangement, whatever it might become, won't work if we're not honest with each other. She put her hand on the box. My husband, she said slowly, was the kind of man who said the right things and then told me very carefully and over a long period of time what I was not permitted to do or say or know. He was not violent. He was simply a door that locked from the outside. She looked at the lamp flame. I came here because I needed somewhere to breathe and somewhere Silas couldn't find me easily. I told myself that was practical and that was sufficient. She met Emmett's eyes. It was practical, but I am beginning to think I might want something more than practical, and that frightens me considerably. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the desert was dark and patient. You don't have to decide anything tonight, Emmett said. Not yet. No, she said. I know. He looked at the box. Is there anything I can do? She thought about it honestly, because he deserved a real answer. There's a federal attorney in Santa Fe, she said. A man named Radwell. He's the kind of man Silas can't reach. If I could get documentation to him through official channels, it would matter significantly. I know a man who rides to Santa Fe twice a month, Emmett said. His name is Cisco. He's trustworthy. Then that would help, she said. They sat at the kitchen table for another hour, talking carefully about practical things. The water rights, the investigator in town, what Silas Morrow was likely to do when he found her. Emmett listened completely, the way she had almost forgotten people could listen without preparing his response while she was still talking. When she finally stood to go to bed, she took the iron box from the table. At the doorway, she paused. Emmett, she said. It was the first time she had used his name. She felt a small shift in the air between them when she said it. Yes, he said. Thank you for not opening it, she said. It matters more than I can tell you. He looked at her steadily, and in the lamplight his face was less guarded than she had yet seen it, the thing beneath the management showing through in fragments. Not a man without feeling. A man who had taught himself to keep feeling at considerable distance for very good reasons, and who was perhaps, only perhaps, beginning to reconsider the policy. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow needs thinking through. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the east-facing room and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she had done. She had told a virtual stranger, a man she had known for 8 days, about Silas Morrow, about the box, about the murder that her husband may or may not have brought on himself by simply knowing too much and waiting too long to decide what to do about it. She had not told the lawyer in Topeka everything she knew. She had told no one the full account, not in Abilene during those urgent weeks of preparation, not in the letter she had written to Emmett's advertisement, which had offered him her practical qualities and said nothing about the rest. She had told him because she had seen the investigator through the general store window, and the world had narrowed to the dimensions of an immediate problem, and telling Emmett had been part of solving it. That was what she told herself. But she also knew she had told him because watching him read those survey documents on her 4th day here, watching him register the discrepancy she had found, and look at her with actual respect, the particular respect given to something genuinely worth respecting, she had felt something she had not felt in 3 years of marriage to a man who called her exceptional while ensuring she remained exceptional only in ways that served him. The sense of being seen by someone who was looking at what was actually there. This was dangerous. She had cataloged it. She was keeping it at careful distance. She pressed her hand against the iron box beside the bed. In the morning, she would be practical. Morning was when the work was manageable. It was only at night, when the work was finished and the house was quiet, that she could feel the full shape of everything she was not yet permitting herself to want. The days that followed had a quality she did not have precise words for. The quality of two people engaged in the genuine, unplanned process of knowing each other, neither hurrying it nor holding it back, simply letting it accumulate the way sediment accumulates almost imperceptibly, until one day you realize the landscape has changed. She learned that Emmett made a specific expression when something in the accounts was wrong. A slight narrowing around the eyes, a barely perceptible tightening at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a frown but was adjacent to one. She learned that Clara hummed while she worked, never the same melody twice, always something she was inventing as she went, and that Emmett always turned toward the sound when he heard it, the way a man turns toward a fire unconsciously because the fire is warm and the alternative is cold. She learned that he made coffee too strong because he had lived alone with his own preferences for 6 years and no one had suggested otherwise. She learned this on the 3rd morning and said nothing about it, and simply made the coffee herself on the 4th morning, slightly less strong, and he drank it without comment. That was something. She learned the small archaeology of the house itself, the way the 3rd step from the bottom grown differently depending on the weather. The coffee beans kept on the 2nd shelf rather than the 1st. Clara had knocked the 1st shelf jar down twice, and so the beans had been quietly relocated without announcement or ceremony. This small accommodation made without drama or comment told her more about who Emmett Hale was than many larger things could have. She was thinking about this, about the particular simplicity of a man who reorganizes his kitchen without making it anyone else's burden. When she found him in the barn one afternoon, sitting on a hay bale, with a letter in his hand and his face showing the look of someone receiving news that does not surprise them, but lands hard regardless. "What is it?" she said. He held the letter out without a word. She took it and read. It was from the Faro Land Syndicate's legal counsel. Precisely worded, professionally courteous, the kind of letter that smiles at you from the page while holding something sharp behind its back. It informed Emmett Hale that in light of the territorial court's recent ruling on the Cimarron water rights, the syndicate intended to exercise its easement claims on the North Spring access effective the 1st of January. He would be required to reroute his primary irrigation at his own expense or cease operations on the North pasture entirely. "When did this come?" she said. "This morning," he said. She read it again, more slowly the way her father had taught her to read any document claiming authority, looking not for what it said, but for what it assumed you wouldn't notice. "This is the easement I found the discrepancy in," she said. "The date on the filing doesn't match the territorial register from that year. There are 3 other filings with the same problem." "I know," he said, "but knowing isn't proving, and the court has already ruled." "Which court?" He looked at her. "Circuit," he said. The cold clarity she had felt looking through the general store window settled through her again, sharp as creek water. "Silas's jurisdiction extends to New Mexico territory," she said. "As of 6 months ago," Emmett said, "the expansion was granted quietly. I didn't find out until my neighbor Breck mentioned it last week. Sideways, not meeting my eyes the way a man mentions something he's uncomfortable knowing." "Then it wasn't coincidence," she said. "It was arrangement." They looked at each other in the dim barn. Afternoon light came through gaps in the planks and long angled bars. Outside, the wind had picked up off the mesa with the dry, restless sound she was learning to associate with coming weather. "Emmett," she said, "is the date on this ruling before or after the discrepancy date I found in the easement filing?" He frowned. "After." "Then the court ruled on a document that was already demonstrably altered," she said, "which means the ruling is founded on fraud, which is precisely the kind of thing that would interest a federal court. And it connects your water case directly to everything else in the box." He was quiet for a moment. "You think Silas is involved in this," he said, "not just because of you, because of the water." "I think Silas Morrow goes where his interests require him to go," she said. "And I think this water case became his interest the moment someone with enough money offered him something for it." He looked at the letter in his hands. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Finding the angle that makes things workable," he said. "Even the bad things." He said it carefully, not as criticism, but as observation. A man noting something he found valuable and was not certain how to say directly. "I mean to say I find it useful to be near someone who thinks that way." He stopped as though the words had come out slightly differently than he had shaped them and looked away toward the barn wall. She did not make anything of it. She was learning his grammar, a man who sometimes approached the true statement by way of the approximate one, and trusted you to be paying close enough attention to find it. She was paying very careful attention. October turned toward November. The light over the Cimarron Ridge went lower and sharper. The air in the mornings took on the high desert cold that was clean and knife-edged rather than damp. She rode out with Emmett most mornings now. This had not been formally arranged. It had accumulated. One morning she appeared at the barn, and he saddled a horse, and the next morning she appeared, and he saddled a horse, and by the 3rd morning, it was simply what happened without needing to be named or negotiated. He showed her where the winter water ran from the snowmelt and where it pooled before reaching the spring that fed the north pasture. He showed her the section of fence where posts had to be replaced every 2 years because of something in the soil composition that accelerated the rot, a fact discovered through expensive trial and error over 11 years and now simply accepted as part of the nature of the place. He showed her the flat of good grass at the base of the North Ridge, the meadow she had not yet seen, and said only that it was the best ground on the property and that he hadn't been able to use it the way it deserved because of the water dispute. 9 years, she thought, 9 years farming around a constraint that was fraudulently imposed. He showed her on one of those morning rides the place where the old adobe walls of the original homestead still stood. 3 walls and no roof, the desert reclaiming it steadily, juniper growing through the window openings. He said nothing about it, and she said nothing about it, And she thought about all the people who had looked at this country and tried to make a life in it, and had been broken by the trying, and how the country simply absorbed the evidence of their failure into itself without judgment. And how Emmett Hale was still here after 11 years. This too told her something. On the morning she didn't ride, she worked at the kitchen table with the survey maps and documents. She had written to her contact in Topeka, Walsh, her father's former colleague, the only person in Kansas she trusted entirely, confirming the chain of custody for the original documents she'd sent before leaving Abilene. She had written to Radwell a second time through Cisco, expanding what he knew about the Faro connection and its relationship to the Morrow jurisdiction expansion. She was building the structure of the case the way her father had taught her to read a survey from the outside edges inward, establishing the perimeter before touching the interior. The territorial documents were in better order than she had initially realized. The discrepancy she had found was not alone. It had a family. 3 other filings in the Faro case had similarly mismatched dates, suggesting not a single clerical error, but a pattern of deliberate alteration. She made her notes in a separate ledger she kept locked in her traveling bag, written in her father's surveying shorthand, which she had learned as a child and which she had never met another person who could read fluently. Her father had taught it to her, saying the most useful knowledge is the kind that belongs only to you until you choose to share it. She was choosing very carefully. On the 10th evening, Emmett pushed back from the table and said without preamble, "I want to tell you something about the water dispute, something I haven't told anyone, because it makes me look foolish." She put down her pen. "All right. When the Faro ruling came down 2 years ago, I had a lawyer, a fellow in Santa Fe recommended by a man I trusted. I paid him what he asked, and he told me the case was sound and we'd win on appeal." He paused. "We didn't. He filed the appeal and then wrote to tell me it had been denied, that further action would be expensive and unlikely to succeed." He looked at his hands for a moment. "What I found out later from my neighbor Breck, of all people, was that the lawyer never filed a proper appeal. He filed something, but it was incomplete. Missing documentation, poorly argued, and this man had been described to me as one of the better legal minds in the territory." Another pause. "The lawyer had connections to the Faro Syndicate's legal team. The Santa Fe representation had been arranged before the man ever came to see me." Nora looked at him steadily. "You paid a man who was already bought," she said. "Yes." He said it without self-pity, but without ease either. "I trusted a recommendation and didn't check it. That's not like me. I check everything on this ranch twice. I let the urgency of the situation make me careless." "Silas does that to people," she said. "He creates urgency so you don't check. The urgency is part of the method." "Is that what he did to Daniel?" he said. She thought about this carefully. Daniel was different. Daniel had the inside view. He knew what Silas was doing because he was close enough to see it. They were family. The urgency Silas used on Daniel was personal urgency. The urgency of a family secret of knowing something dangerous and not knowing what to do about it. She looked at the table. Daniel sat on it too long. He was trying to decide what he owed and what it would cost, and whether there was a version of the situation where he could come out of it with clean hands. She was quiet for a moment. There wasn't. There never is not with a man like Silas. "And you," Emmett said. She looked up at him. "I had 3 weeks," she said. "From the moment I opened the box to the moment I left Abilene. I did not try to find a version with clean hands. I tried to find a version that was survivable. They're not always the same thing." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight. "Are they the same here?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "I think they might be," she said. "That's what I'm working toward." Delia Marsh came to the ranch one afternoon in the last week of October. She came without her usual purposeful efficiency, without the apron or the dish towel, or the deliberate domesticity of a woman who has been trying to fill a space. She sat at the kitchen table and said what she had come to say with the directness of a woman who has thought carefully about what she owes a situation and has decided to pay it in full. "I want to say something," Delia said, "and I want you to know I'm saying it because it's true, not because I need anything from you." Nora put down her pen. "All right." "I'm not stupid," Delia said. "I know what's happening here. I knew the moment you walked across that yard." She paused. "I've been telling myself for nearly a year that what Emmett and I had was something real. And maybe it was in its way, but it wasn't what he needed. I knew that. I was hoping if I gave it enough time it would become what he needed." She looked at her hands. I think you should know that I'm not going to fight for something that was never really mine to claim. Delia. I'm not asking for anything, Delia said. I'm saying it plainly so it doesn't have to be said in pieces later. She met Nora's eyes. He's a good man. Clara is a good girl. Don't waste what you've been given here. Nora held her gaze for a long moment. I don't intend to, she said. Delia picked up her basket and went back to the stove, and neither of them mentioned the conversation again, and things were not quite the same afterward, but in some way that resisted simple description, they were easier. The investigator had not been visible in Sweetgrass Crossing for 4 days. This worried Nora more than his presence had. She did what she could do, sent another letter to Walsh and Topeka confirming the copies were secure, sent a brief note to a contact in Kansas City asking for information about Silas's recent movements framed as a social inquiry from a grieving widow checking on the family's well-being. Counted the days until Cisco's next ride to Santa Fe. Ran through the calculations again. How long for Radwell to review what she'd sent? How long for a federal warrant to be prepared? How long before any form of legal protection could be put in place? 3 weeks, she thought. Maybe 4. She had survived worse waits. And then the second stranger came to town. She was at the general store on a Thursday morning, selecting thread and trying to look like someone who was only selecting thread when she became aware of a woman she had not seen in Sweetgrass before. She was perhaps 43, fair-haired, with a traveling coat that had been well used, and a quality of alertness in her movements that Nora recognized from her own mirror, the specific calibrated awareness of a person who is watching for something without wanting to appear to be watching. Not the alert of fear, the alert of a professional. Someone who moved through rooms the way surveyors move through landscapes, noting positions, marking distances. Their eyes met once briefly across the dry goods counter. The woman's gaze was steady and measured, and not accidental. Nora paid for her thread and went back to the wagon. She told Emmett quietly that there was a woman in town she didn't recognize. All right, he said, careful. She wasn't passing through, Nora said. She was looking for someone. I don't know. Maybe. She pressed her hand against the iron box in her lap. There's something I haven't told you, something about Daniel's family. He waited as he always waited, completely without impatience. Daniel had a younger brother, she said. Edmund. He was declared dead in the war, killed at a battle in Georgia according to Silas and the official record. But 3 weeks before Daniel died, he received a letter he said changed everything he thought he knew about his family. He said he needed time to decide what to do with what he'd learned. She looked at the road ahead. He didn't have time, and I've been wondering since I opened the box whether Edmund actually died in that battle, whether he survived and has been watching Silas from somewhere safe, whether he is in fact the person who could corroborate everything in the box from the outside. Emmett drove in silence for a mile. And you think the woman might be connected to him? He said. I don't know. It could be coincidence. She paused. But she looked at me the way someone looks at a person they already know, not deciding but confirming. What do you want to do? Nothing today, she said. I want to see if she's still here tomorrow. She was. On Friday morning, the woman was sitting on the boarding house porch when Nora rode past. She looked up when she heard the horse. This time she made no pretense of looking elsewhere. She held Nora's gaze with the calm, direct attention of someone who has made a decision and is prepared to act on it. Nora dismounted. She tied her horse to the rail. She walked up the steps. I'm Nora Calloway, she said. The woman studied her, taking her measure in the unhurried way Emmett had looked at her on her first evening, the serious assessment of someone deciding whether reality matches preparation. I know who you are, the woman said. My name is Ada Cross. I write for the Albuquerque Chronicle. A pause. I knew Edmund Calloway. Nora sat down in the chair across from her. Tell me, she said. Ada Cross told it methodically in the order it had happened without embellishment. Edmund Calloway had not died in Georgia. He had been badly wounded and left for dead, and had survived as men sometimes do, who have more stubbornness than sense, and something unfinished keeping them in the world. He had spent 14 months recovering in a farmhouse in northern Georgia, tended by a farm family who helped him for no reason except that he was a human being and badly hurt. By the time he could travel, Silas had been declared his legal heir, and Edmund's name had been removed from every official record a living person's name appears on. He came west, Ada said, to Albuquerque 4 years ago. He had been surviving quietly for 2 years by then, staying below the surface, out of Silas's sight. He knew by that point what Silas had done, what Silas was still doing. He had been gathering for years, not formally, but gathering letters, financial records, the testimony of men who had dealt with Silas and found the dealing costly. Her voice remained level throughout, the voice of a woman accustomed to narrating difficult things clearly. He contacted me because he needed someone with access to print and someone who could move through the territory without attracting Silas's attention. We worked together for 3 years. And Daniel, Nora said. Edmund found Daniel 8 months before Daniel died. He traced him through the Abilene Bar Association records. He wrote carefully, not knowing whether Daniel knew what Silas had done or was part of it. She paused. Daniel wrote back. He confirmed that he had known for some time that the trust fund administration was irregular, had been watching it quietly without knowing what to do about what he was seeing. Edmund's letter showed him the full scope of it, a pause that contained something careful. He also confirmed that he had a wife. He said she was capable. He said if anything happened to him and if there were materials to preserve, she would know what to do with them. Nora sat with this for a moment. He said that, she said. Yes. She looked at her hands in her lap. Daniel had said she was capable. He had said it to a brother he hadn't spoken to in 15 years before coming home and pressing a box into her hands with nothing beyond, keep it hidden and be careful. He had said it apparently with considerably more confidence than he had ever shown her directly. She thought about this. She thought about a man who had made her world smaller and had known he was making it smaller, and who had at the end done the only thing he could think of to reverse even a small part of the damage. She thought about whether that was enough. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. And after Daniel died, she said, Edmund died 14 months ago, Ada said with the careful evenness of someone who has processed a grief and still carries its shape. Cholera in Albuquerque. There was an outbreak. She looked at the street, then back. Before he died, he gave me everything he'd gathered, all of it. He told me that Daniel's wife had a box of materials, that she had left Abilene, that if she reached out, or if I found her, the two collections together would be what was needed to finish it. She looked at Nora steadily. And then Silas's investigator appeared in Sweetgrass, and my source here sent me a message and I came. Who is your source? Nora asked. Ada almost smiled. Okafor at the livery. He's been watching this town for me for 2 years. Nora thought about the broad, silent liveryman who had asked her no questions and had her rolling north within 20 minutes of her arrival in Sweetgrass. She filed this new understanding of him with the equanimity of someone who has learned not to show surprise at how pieces fit together once you can finally see the whole picture. She thought about Edmund, a man she had never met, a man who had survived a battlefield on sheer stubbornness and then come west and spent 3 years gathering from the outside what Daniel had gathered from the inside, building a case he might never live to use, trusting that someone would finish what he started. He had been right about Daniel. He had been right about her. She found sitting on the boarding house porch with the cold morning air against her face that she wanted to be worthy of having been trusted by a man she would never meet. What do you need from me? She asked. What's in the box? Ada said. Not to publish, not yet. I want to see whether what Edmund gathered and what Daniel gathered say the same things. If the financial records match, if the names are the same, if the dates align. She paused. I have a contact at the federal circuit, a judge who is not in Silas's pocket. If your evidence and Edmund's together go to Radwell in Santa Fe with that judge's name attached, Radwell will move. I already have materials with Radwell, Nora said. I know, Ada said. I'm saying there'll be enough. Together, there'll be more than enough. She looked at Nora steadily. This is the case Edmund spent 3 years building. It is the case your husband died before he could make. They both gave what they had to give. I think it's time to finish it. Nora sat on the boarding house porch in the cold October morning and thought about 2 dead men, Daniel Calloway, who had given her a box and an apology in the same act, and Edmund Calloway, who had survived Georgia and come west and gathered and died of cholera with his case still open. And she thought about what it meant to be the person holding the thread that finished what they couldn't. I need to speak with someone first, she said. I need a day. Ada nodded. I'll be here. She rode back to the ranch and found Emmett mending the corral gate in the cold morning. She told him everything Ada had said, standing with the gate between them, and he listened until she finished before he spoke. "Do you trust her?" he said. "I trust that her reasons align with mine," she said. "That's not the same as trust, but it's a workable foundation." She paused. "I want to compare what's in the box with what she has. If it aligns, if the same names and payments and dates appear in both sets, then Edmund spent 3 years gathering from the outside what Daniel gathered from the inside. Two independent sources reaching the same conclusion. Radwell can move on that." Emmett fixed the gate latch, clicked it shut, and turned to face her fully. He was in his work coat hat, pushed back on his head, hands calloused and still at his sides. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to ride to town and speak with Breck," she said. "Not to tell him everything, enough to know where he stands, enough to give him the information he needs to make a decision when the time comes." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "And tonight? Tonight I'm going through the box again," she said. "Everything in it in order with fresh eyes. Because tomorrow I'm going to open it in front of someone I've known for less than a day, and I need to be certain of every page before I do that." He looked at her for a moment. "Nora," he said. "Yes. This is the right thing," he said. "I know you already know that. I'm saying it anyway because sometimes it helps to hear it from outside your own head." She looked at him, at the weathered, careful face of a man who was not eloquent and who was nevertheless saying exactly what needed to be said. "Yes," she said. "It helps." He picked up his tools. She went inside. That night she lay in the east-facing room and thought about what tomorrow required. She had been carrying the box for 7 months. She had carried it through the last weeks in Abilene, when she was afraid to leave the house, and on the train west, and into a household she did not know. And through 3 weeks of learning this land and these people and this strange, large, red earth country. The box had been the weight at the center of everything. The thing she was protecting, the thing she was running from, the thing she was moving toward, some resolution she could not yet fully see. Tomorrow she would open it in front of Ada Cross. She would share the burden of it, which was also the power of it, which was also the thing she had been most afraid to do. She reached down and touched the cold iron in the dark. She thought about Edmund Calloway surviving Georgia on stubbornness alone. She thought about Daniel pressing the box into her hands in March and being right about the time. She thought about what it meant to finish something on behalf of people who could not finish it themselves. She kept her hand on the box. She closed her eyes. She slept. In the kitchen that same night, she was reasonably certain Emmett was also awake. She had heard his footsteps after midnight, the particular sound of a man moving through his own house, the way he moves when he doesn't want to be heard, which is different from the way he moves normally in small telling details. He had gone to the kitchen and come back. She had heard the faint sound of water being drawn and then the silence of someone sitting still in the dark. She had not gotten up. Some things are private even in a household where you have begun carefully and without formal announcement to belong to each other. But she had thought about it, about what it would look like from the outside. These two careful people in this quiet house, both awake at midnight for reasons they hadn't said out loud, both thinking about tomorrow and what it required and what it might change. She thought about how you would describe that to someone who hadn't been inside it. She thought the description would be inadequate. Some things are only fully comprehensible from the inside. She had been inside a great many things in her life and had not always been permitted to say so. She was beginning to understand that this too was over, that she had come far enough from Abilene and built enough of something real here that she was permitted now to know what she knew and say what she saw and take up the space she actually occupied. She pulled the quilt up and looked at the ceiling. In the morning, she thought, "Tonight you rest." She listened to the desert, the insects, the wind, the horses shifting in the corral, and eventually, somewhere in the last hours before dawn, she slept. The next morning, Nora sat at the kitchen table with Ada Cross and opened the iron box for the first time in another person's presence. Her hands were steady. She had trained them to be steady over the course of the 7 months since March, since Daniel had pressed the box into her hands and she had stood in the hallway of their fine Abilene house and understood all at once that the life she was living had been built on a foundation she had never been permitted to see. Her hands had shaken then. She had trained them out of it. Trembling was information, and she had already given too much information to too many people for too long. She laid the contents on the kitchen table, one item at a time, in the order she had established: correspondence first, then financial records, then the official documents with Daniel's annotations, and finally the sealed envelope he had marked. Private, in his careful attorney's handwriting, underlined once, with the kind of care a man uses when he knows the thing he is marking may outlast him. She had not opened the sealed envelope. She had carried it for 7 months without opening it, because opening it felt like a kind of ending she was not ready for. She opened it now with Ada across the table and Emmett standing at the kitchen doorway. It was a letter. 5 pages in Daniel's careful hand, dated 3 weeks before his death. She read it slowly. He had known he wrote for approximately 2 months before he died, since the letter from Edmund. He had known that Silas had orchestrated the theft of the public trust funds, had manipulated territorial court appointments, and had been systematically eliminating anyone who could testify to what he had done. He had known that he himself was in danger. He had known and he had been afraid, and he had not known what to do with the fear, and while he was deciding what to do about it, the time ran out. He had also written this: "I know I was not the husband you deserved. I know I made your world smaller than it should have been. I am sorry for this in ways I do not have the skill to adequately express. I am giving you the box because you are the most capable person I know, and because I do not know anyone else I can trust with it. I hope it gives you something useful. I hope it gives you freedom." She folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. Ada was watching her. "He knew," Nora said. "Yes," Ada said gently. "He knew about Edmund, about the land trust, about all of it." "Yes." Nora looked at her hands on the table for a long moment. Something was moving through her that she did not have a precise name for. Not grief exactly, not anger exactly, but something that encompassed both and extended beyond them into the specific, difficult feeling of understanding a person clearly for the first time after they are no longer present to be understood. He had known, and he had not told her. He had managed her the same way he managed everything, by determining what she needed to know and withholding the rest right up until the moment he could not withhold anymore. And then at the end, he had given her the one thing he had that was worth giving and called her capable and let that be his best attempt at an apology. She thought about that. She thought about a man who had made her world smaller and had been ashamed of it. She thought about whether what he had given her at the end was enough. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. Some things could be both insufficient and real at the same time, and the real part did not cancel the insufficient part, and the insufficient part did not cancel the real part. And living with that particular mathematics was simply part of what it meant to have loved someone imperfectly and lost them. She looked up. "Let's compare documents," she said. They worked for 3 hours. Ada spread Edmund's materials across the table. Nora spread hers. They went through them methodically, Ada reading entries from Edmund's records, while Nora checked them against Daniel's, and then Nora reading from Daniel's, while Ada checked against Edmund's. The financial records matched. The names were the same. The dates aligned. Not approximately. Precisely. The payment amounts that appeared in Silas's correspondence in Daniel's collection appeared in the financial records Edmund had obtained from the Faro Syndicate's former bookkeeper, a man who had left the company under contested circumstances and who had been willing in exchange for Edmund's help relocating to California to provide a full accounting of what had passed through the company's accounts over 11 years. The payments to Silas were documented from both directions, the outgoing transfer from the Faro accounts and the incoming receipt from Silas's own records. There was no interpretation required. The evidence stated what it was. She had not let herself see how careful Daniel had been until she saw it reflected in Edmund's parallel work. Daniel had annotated everything: dates, relationships between documents, the chain of custody for each piece of correspondence. He had worked in the precise, quietly obsessive manner of a man who understood that a case built on incomplete records is worse than no case at all. He had been afraid he had written. While he was deciding what to do about the fear, the time ran out. But the work itself showed nothing of the fear. The work was meticulous. The work was, she thought, the most honest thing he had ever given her. Edmund's material showed a different methodology. The journalist's instinct, the accumulation of sources rather than documents. He had letters from 3 separate witnesses to conversations they had overheard between Silas and the Faro representatives. He had a sworn statement from the bookkeeper. He had a copy of the original Hale land grant from 1871 obtained from the Territorial Land Office and annotated in his own hand with the specific fraudulent alterations made to the Faro easement filing. The alterations were circled in red ink. Looking at those circles, Nora understood that Edmund had not been subtle by choice. He had been careful because careful was what the situation required. And he had finally reached the point where he could be plain, and the circled alterations were a kind of plainness. Here, look here. This is the lie, and I am done speaking around it. What Edmund had gathered from the outside and what Daniel had gathered from the inside were two halves of the same picture, and together they were overwhelming. Nora had known this was likely. She had believed it was likely. Belief and proof are different in kind, not merely degree in sitting at the table, looking at two independent collections of documents that said the same things in the same numbers with the same names. That was proof. It had a different quality from belief. It landed differently in the chest. Ada sat back and looked at what they had assembled between them. "This is enough," she said. "More than enough." Nora looked at the documents spread across the kitchen table. "Then we need to get it to Radwell," she said, "before Silas gets here." "He's already closer than you think," Ada said. Nora looked at her. "My source in Kansas City sent word yesterday morning," Ada said. "Silas left on a train 3 days ago. He has 2 men with him. Not investigators this time." She paused. "He'll be in Sweetgrass by Saturday." Today was Thursday. Nora pressed her hands flat on the table. "Then we have 2 days," she said. She said it calmly. She let the deadline become concrete, let it settle through her, and become a tool rather than a fear. 2 days. She knew what 2 days could contain and what they couldn't, and she knew which category each necessary action fell into. "What can you do from here?" she asked Ada. "I can write the narrative document today," Ada said. "An organized summary of the combined evidence. Dates, names, amounts, the full chain of the Faro connection to the Morrow jurisdiction expansion. Something Radwell can read in an hour and understand completely." She paused. "I can also send a message to my contact at the Federal Circuit. If he receives confirmation from me directly that the evidence is what I've described, he will put pressure on Radwell to move before Silas's Washington lawyers can file any blocking motions." "Then do both," Nora said. "Today." Ada nodded. "And you? I need to get a complete second set of copies to Cisco and on his way to Santa Fe today," Nora said. "Not just what I've already sent, everything, including Edmund's materials, both sets together with the cross-reference document I'll write this afternoon." She paused. "And I need to talk to Emmett about Breck." She and Emmett talked that night for 2 hours after Clara was in bed. He had a directness in these conversations that she had come to rely on. He didn't dress things up, didn't avoid the hard calculations, didn't pretend the situation was less serious than it was. "Breck," he said, meaning the county sheriff. "He's been cooperative with Faro, which means he's probably cooperative with Silas. Can he be worked around? Depends on what Silas brings," Emmett said. "A federal warrant from Radwell outranks anything Breck has. But if Silas arrives before Radwell moves, Breck could use the time against us." "How much time does Breck give us if we approach him directly?" she said. Emmett thought about this. "Breck's not stupid. He knows the Faro easement documentation is shaky. I've been making noise about it for months. If Silas shows up and the case against him is already in federal hands, Breck won't want to be on the wrong side of that history." "Then we tell Breck," she said. "Not everything. Enough." Emmett looked at her. "You'd trust Breck with enough?" "I'd trust his self-interest with enough," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had learned was his version of a smile. Not the movement of his mouth, but something in his eyes. A brief warmth that appeared and was then carefully managed away. "All right," he said. "We tell Breck enough." "Something else," she said. "When Silas comes, and he will come, I want you to know what I'll do." He looked at her steadily. "If the warrant has arrived, we use it," she said. "Breck won't stop us. The evidence is already in Santa Fe. Silas can posture all he likes, but he can't reach a federal filing." She paused. "If the warrant hasn't arrived, if Radwell moves too slowly, or Silas's lawyers file something to delay it, I need you to understand that I won't let him use this ranch as a bargaining chip. I won't let him threaten the water rights or Clara's safety to pressure me." "Meaning," Emmett said. "Meaning if it comes to it, I'll meet him in town, on neutral ground. I'll face him there and tell him directly that everything is already in Radwell's hands, and the only thing left is for the process to complete. that there is nothing he can do to me that will undo what's already been done. She looked at the table. I'd rather that conversation happen in Sweetgrass than on your property. Emmett was quiet for a moment. That's not going to happen, he said. Emmett, I mean, he's not going to get within talking distance of you without me present, he said. That's not a debate I'm willing to have. He paused. I understand what you're doing. You're managing the situation, finding the angle. I've watched you do it for 3 weeks, and I think it's one of the most remarkable things I've ever watched a person do. He paused again. But there are situations where finding the angle means you end up carrying everything yourself. I'm not going to let that happen. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. I'm not used to that, she said. I know, he said. I'm telling you anyway. She looked at him for a long time, at the face that was weathered and careful and, she permitted herself to see this now, genuinely decent in the specific, unglamorous way that genuine decency actually works. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily day after day in small decisions made when no one is watching. He had not placed himself between her and the situation as a performance of protection. He had done it the way he checked the water barrel before coming inside at night because that was what needed to be done, and that was who he was. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. I'm going to check the north fence before it gets too dark, he said. You should eat something. She almost laughed. You're going to check the fence right now. I'm worried about the fence and I'm worried about you, he said. The fence at least I can do something about tonight. He went out. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about a man going to check his fence in the cold, because that was what needed to be done, and that was who he was, and she thought, I am in very serious trouble here, and I would not trade it for anything in this world. Clara knew something was happening. She was 11 years old, and she had her father's particular gift for reading the temperature of a room, and she had spent 3 weeks watching Nora with serious comprehensive attention. She was the kind of child who noticed things and said nothing about them until she had decided what they meant and then said them plainly. On the night before Silas was due to arrive, she came to the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, with her arms crossed in the posture that meant she was preparing to ask a question she was not certain she had the right to ask. Is something bad coming? She said. Nora looked up from the papers. She thought about how to answer this. She had spent 3 years being managed by someone who answered every difficult question with something smooth and untrue, and she had learned from the inside out how much that costs. Not just to the person being managed, but to the relationship, to the trust, to the sense that truth is something anyone is willing to say out loud. She was not going to do that to Clara. A difficult situation is coming, she said. Not dangerous, not in a way that means anyone is going to be hurt, but a man is coming who is going to try to take me away from here, and I'm going to make sure he can't. Clara stood in the doorway and absorbed this. Is he the one you ran from? She said. Nora met her eyes steadily. Yes. And you're not going to run again? No, Nora said. I'm done running. Clara thought about this with the serious, careful thinking face that looked so much like Emmett's. It sometimes caught Nora completely off guard. What are we going to do? She said. Nora noted the we without remarking on it. Tomorrow morning, she said, I'm going to meet with the woman at the boarding house. She's a journalist. She writes for a newspaper in Albuquerque. She has information that, together with mine, is enough to stop the man who's coming. She paused. Your father is going to ride to speak with the sheriff, and a federal attorney in Santa Fe has been given everything he needs to open a formal case. What do I do? Clara asked. You go to school, Nora said. You have your arithmetic examination today. Clara's expression shifted very slightly. That's not what I meant, she said. I know, Nora said. I'm telling you the most important thing you can do, which is to let the people who are handling this handle it. You being at school safe is what I need. Clara stood in the doorway for another moment. All right, she said. She started to turn away, then stopped. Nora. Yes, he's not going to take you, she said. Not a question. A declaration. The same flat certainty Emmett used when he said things he had decided were simply true. No, Nora said. He's not. Clara went to bed. Nora sat for a long time after looking at the papers and thinking about an 11-year-old girl who had lost her mother and kept her father's secrets, and was prepared with remarkable composure to claim a woman she'd known for 3 weeks as someone worth standing up for. She had not expected to be claimed. She had not thought to want it. She understood now that she had been wrong about both. She wrote the message to Radwell that same evening, before she slept, before she had time to second-guess the phrasing. She had been composing it in her head for 3 days, which was long enough. Longer than that, and the language stopped improving and started calcifying, and a calcified letter to a federal attorney was not what the situation required. She wrote it at the kitchen table after Emmett had gone to check the horses, and Clara was asleep, and she wrote it in the plain direct language her father had used when documenting a disputed survey state. What you know, state why you know it, state what you need to happen next, and do not use more words than the situation requires. She signed it Nora Calloway and sealed it and set it on the kitchen shelf. Then she sat at the table for a moment longer looking at the lamp. She thought about what she was doing, not just the letter, the whole of it. She thought about the shape of the past 7 months from a distance, the way you can only see a landscape's full shape once you've climbed high enough above it. She had been so close to it, running through it, that she had not always been able to see it clearly. Now sitting in the kitchen of a house that had become, without her quite realizing it, a place where she could think she could see it. She had been running. That was true. She had been afraid. That was also true. She had made the best decisions available to her under difficult circumstances with incomplete information, and she had made some of them well and some of them less well, and none of them had been cowardly. She could see that now. Looking back from a distance, she could see that the woman who had stood on the Dodge City platform and refused to surrender the box was not a woman who was going to be destroyed by what Silas Morrow had done. She was a woman who was going to finish what needed finishing. She was almost done. She stood up and put out the lamp and went to bed. Saturday came cold and cloudless, the kind of late October day that feels like a held breath. The sky a deep, undisturbed blue, and the air sharp enough to make the mesa stand out against it with unusual clarity, every red ledge and dark juniper line distinct. Emmett came with her to give the letter to Cisco, which had not been discussed and had also not been surprising. He had simply been at the barn when she arrived, and he had fallen into step beside her without comment, and that had been that. They walked to Cisco's place in the early morning dark, the coldest part of the day, the hour before the desert decides to warm, and she gave Cisco the sealed packet, and he looked at her face and said, "Yes, ma'am," without being asked, and was saddled and riding north before the sky had begun to lighten in earnest. They walked back in the growing light. "I keep trying to prepare for what it will be like when he comes," she said, "and I keep finding that I can't. Not because I don't know what he'll do. I know roughly what he'll do, but because the last time I saw him was across Daniel's grave, and I keep returning to that image when I try to imagine facing him again." "What did he look like?" Emmett said. She thought about it honestly. "Composed," she said. "Utterly composed. The grief was exactly right. Not too much and not too little. And he stood in his black suit, and he looked across that grave at me, and I could see him calculating, registering that I might be a problem, filing me under things to be handled." She paused. "He looked at me the way Daniel had looked at me for 3 years, like a variable in an equation he was solving, something with a value that could be determined and accounted for and then set aside." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "And what do you want to look like when he sees you again?" he said. She looked at the road. "Like someone who already finished the equation," she said. He nodded once. The desert was waking up around them. The first birds, the warming air, the sky going from purple to orange over the mesa. She thought about what she had said and thought it was true and was glad to have said it and was glad he had asked the question that produced it. "I want him to come here and find that it's already done," she said. "That there's nothing left for him to prevent because the preventing is over. That he can threaten and posture and file all the blocking motions his Washington lawyers can produce, but the thing is already in motion and he cannot stop it from where he is." She paused. "I want him to understand clearly and without any possible misinterpretation that I was not the variable in his equation. I was the person who solved it." Emmett walked beside her in silence. "Yes," he said finally. Simply. The way he said things that were simply true and needed no embellishment. They walked back to the ranch in the early morning light, and the day began the way days at the Hale Ranch had begun to begin: coffee and the accounts, and Clara appearing with her school bag and her serious face and her capacity for assessment, and Emmett moving through the practical necessities of the morning with the patient thoroughness of a man who has decided that each day is worth doing correctly regardless of what is coming. She found this privately one of the most stabilizing things she had ever been adjacent to. On the morning before Silas was due to arrive, she took the iron box down from the shelf and sat with it at the kitchen table one last time. She opened the lid and looked at the documents inside, not to review them, not to annotate them further, but simply to see them. She had spent 7 months with these papers. She knew them the way she knew the layout of this kitchen, the rhythm of the evenings, the sound of Emmett's boots on the third step from the bottom. They were part of the texture of the last 7 months in the same way those other things were, and she wanted to see them one more time before she let them go. Daniel's handwriting on the correspondence, careful and precise, the handwriting of a man who had been trained to exactness and who had brought that exactness to a task that had in the end cost him everything. Edmund's red ink circles on the altered filings, the plain insistence of a man who had been patient for a very long time and was now being absolutely clear. Ada's organizing notes in her journalist shorthand, connecting things across the two collections. And her own notes, her father's surveying shorthand, the private language he had given her, the knowledge that belonged only to her until she chose to share it. She had chosen to share it. She was glad of that choice. She sorted the documents into their two packets, the copies she was keeping, the originals going to Radwell, and sealed the original packet with the care she had given to everything in these 7 months and set it on the shelf. Tomorrow when Silas came, the originals would already be in Santa Fe. He could take the box, he could take the copies, he could take whatever he found. None of it would matter. She closed the lid. Judge Silas Morrow arrived in Sweetgrass Crossing in the early afternoon on a gray horse with 2 men flanking him. They were not investigators this time. They were the kind of men Silas kept for situations that had moved past investigation. Larger men, quieter men whose purpose was less to ask questions than to discourage the asking of them. He came to the ranch. Nora was in the kitchen when she heard the horses in the yard. She looked out the window and saw them. She looked at the iron box on the shelf, now containing only copies. The originals were in Radwell's hands, or very nearly. She had everything she needed. She had prepared for this moment for 7 months. She took a breath. She went out. The yard was ordinary in the way that yards are ordinary. The corral, the barn, the windmill, turning in the cold air, the red earth pale in the November light. She stood in the middle of it and watched Silas ride through the gate and pull up his horse, and she felt the particular quality of this moment, the convergence of 7 months of preparation with the reality she had been preparing for. And she let herself feel it fully, and then she set it aside because there was no room right now for feeling. He looked older than she remembered. The months since Daniel's funeral had not been gentle to him, but his composure was intact. The specific composure of a man who has calculated every angle in a room before entering it, and who has never yet entered a room he could not control. Nora, Silas said. He said her name with the particular warmth of a man who has decided warmth is the most effective opening position. The warmth of a concerned family member who has finally located his missing sister-in-law. There you are. We have all been so worried. Silas, she said. Emmett had come from the barn. He stood at the edge of the yard, equidistant between her and the riders, with his hat pushed back and his face showing nothing useful. His hands were at his sides, still, ready, not threatening, simply present with the specific quality of presence that is its own form of statement. I've come to bring you home, Silas said. You've had a difficult time. Grief makes us do things we wouldn't ordinarily consider. Coming all this way. He looked briefly at Emmett with the specific dismissal of a man who considers other men to be obstacles rather than people. This arrangement. No one blames you, Nora. Daniel's death was hard on everyone who loved him. Daniel's death, she said. A brief flicker. So brief she would have missed it 3 years ago before she learned to read the temperature beneath composed faces. He hadn't expected her to stop him there. Of course, you were in shock. You made a decision that was perhaps that I stand behind, she said. Something hardened in his face. The warmth became its own opposite. Not quite cold, but the temperature of quiet authority, the voice of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. Nora, his voice changed registers. I have with me a document from the Missouri Circuit requiring you to appear to complete the administration of Daniel's estate. There are records that need to be examined. Documents that may be relevant to certain proceedings I have the authority to initiate. There are, she agreed pleasantly. They're in Santa Fe. He went very still on his gray horse. They arrived yesterday morning, she said, along with a full account of the trust fund disbursements, the Faro Land Syndicate payments, the altered survey filings, and a complete history of the territorial jurisdiction expansion you arranged 6 months ago. She watched his face carefully cataloging. Federal Attorney Radwell has been in receipt of those materials since approximately yesterday noon. I expect he's had time to read them by now. He reads quickly. Silas stood very still. She watched him recalibrate. She had watched him do this before, in courtrooms, at dinner tables across open graves. He was a man who was never without a position to retreat to, and she watched him assess his positions now with the rapid, practiced assessment of someone who has always had options and is discovering that the options are fewer than they should be. You're making a serious mistake, he said. The warmth was entirely gone. What remained was something she recognized, the specific register of a man who is accustomed to winning and is looking for the lever that will still allow it. I've thought about that very carefully, she said. I don't believe I am. He looked at Emmett. His eyes made the calculation that men like Silas always make. The assessment of what can be used, what can be pressured, where the leverage is. Your water rights dispute, he said to Emmett. His voice shifted again. Businessman now reasonable, the voice of a man who has something to offer. The Faro easement is legally filed and supported by territorial court ruling. There may be ways to reach an accommodation on the enforcement timeline depending on... The easement is fraudulently filed, Emmett said. His voice was completely even. As the territorial surveyor will confirm when he arrives next week. As the federal case against you will demonstrate in considerable detail, given that the same hand that altered the Faro filings also arranged your jurisdiction expansion in this territory. Silas looked from one of them to the other, and Nora watched him make the calculation she had been waiting for him to make, the slow, cold recognition that the situation was not what he had prepared for, that he had ridden into this yard expecting a frightened woman with a box of papers she didn't know how to use, and found instead a woman who had spent 7 months learning exactly how to use them with a federal attorney already reading, and a man who could not be pressured standing at her side. Sheriff Breck, he said, a last attempt at leverage. Is aware of the federal investigation, Nora said. He mentioned it to you this morning, I understand. He mentioned it to me this afternoon as a courtesy. A silence that had weight in it. Silas Morrow looked at her across the yard of the Hale Ranch in the cold November afternoon, with the red mesa behind her and the enormous patient sky overhead, and she looked back at him, and she did not look away, and she was not afraid. She thought about Daniel pressing the box into her hands in March. She thought about the train platform in Dodge City. She thought about the first evening in this kitchen, sitting across from a man she didn't know with an iron box in her lap, in a story she wasn't yet ready to tell. She thought about 3 weeks of learning what she had been wrong about, and what she had been right about, and what was still possible. She thought, I am standing in my yard. This is my yard. He has no authority here. She thought about Emmett Calloway surviving Georgia on stubbornness alone, gathering for years in a territory where he officially did not exist, trusting that what he built would be used. She thought, it is being used right now. He was right to trust. This isn't finished, Silas said. No, she said. It isn't, but it's begun, and you cannot stop it from here. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. She watched him ride out of the yard with his 2 men behind him, and she stood in the cold afternoon and breathed, and Emmett came to stand beside her and did not touch her and did not say anything, and was simply there, which was, she thought, exactly what she needed. He'll go back and regroup, she said. Probably, Emmett said. He'll try to complicate the federal case. He has connections. Probably, Emmett said again. This is not over. No, he said, but today it's over. She looked at the gate where Silas's horse had been. Today it's over, she said. Clara appeared in the doorway of the house, her serious face tracking them with the careful assessment she turned on everything important in her life. Is he gone? She said. For now, Emmett said. Clara looked from her father to Nora and back. Good, she said, and went back inside. Nora stood in the yard and looked at the mesa going dark against the sky, and she thought about the iron box on the kitchen shelf, and Ada Cross writing at the boarding house table, and Cisco somewhere on the road to Santa Fe, and the letter Daniel had written her that she had read once, and folded carefully, and would need to read many more times before she understood all of what it meant. She thought about hope, and whether what she was feeling now was the same hope she had felt 3 weeks ago, or something larger. She thought it might be something considerably larger. The weeks after Silas's departure had the particular quality of an aftermath. Not peace exactly, but the absence of immediate danger, which is its own form of rest. The air in the house was different. She noticed it in Clara first, a loosening around the shoulders, a return of the humming. The girl did her schoolwork at the kitchen table now, instead of retreating to her room. And the humming was always something incomplete, always something invented on the spot, and Emmett would hear it from across the house and turn toward the sound the way a man turns toward a fire, unconsciously, because it was warm and the alternative was dark. Nora permitted herself no similar loosening. She knew better. 4 days after Silas left, Radwell wrote from Santa Fe. The federal case was open. The materials had been received and reviewed and were. Radwell wrote among the most complete and carefully organized evidentiary packages he had encountered in 22 years of federal practice. He also wrote, Morrow has retained counsel in Washington. This will take time and he will contest every step. Do not relax your vigilance. She read it twice, folded it, and filed it in her traveling bag under things she knew. She told Emmett that evening at the kitchen table. He listened completely. How long, he said. Months, she said. Maybe longer. He'll find procedural ways to slow it. He always has. But it's open. It's open, she said. It's in federal hands and it's open and Silas cannot close it from here. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. She had learned by now what that meant. It was not resignation. It was not defeat. It was the particular response of a man who had spent 11 years absorbing bad news about the water rights, who had learned to take the shape of a thing in and then set it in the proper place, and then get up the next morning and do what the morning required. She found it privately one of the most useful qualities she had ever encountered in a person. Silas's territorial jurisdiction over New Mexico was suspended pending review. The Faro Land Syndicate's January enforcement claim went into immediate limbo. The territorial surveyor was due the following Tuesday. Emmett said nothing when she told him, but she watched something happen in the set of his shoulders. A fraction of a degree of relief so carefully contained she would have missed it if she hadn't been paying very close attention to the exact architecture of how he carried difficulty. She had been paying very close attention. The surveyor arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. His name was Garland. He was a thin, precise man who said almost nothing, looked at everything, and spent 2 full days walking the north boundary with his notebooks and his measuring chains before he said anything definitive. On the second afternoon, he came to the kitchen and told them in the flat declarative manner of a man whose professional value lies in stating exactly what is, and nothing more that the easement filing contained, altered survey markers that the dates on 3 separate Faro filings did not match the territorial register from those years, and that his preliminary finding supported the original 1871 Hale grant without qualification. He left before dark. Emmett stood in the kitchen doorway after the sound of hoofbeats faded and looked at the north ridge line visible through the window over the sink, catching the last flat November light. He did not say anything for almost a full minute. Nora stood beside him and said nothing either. She had learned the grammar of his silences, which were the silences of a man working something through, and which were the silences that had come to their natural completion and only needed to be witnessed. This was the second kind. 9 years, he said finally, quietly. Yes, she said. 9 years farming around something that was never real. She looked at the ridge. It was real enough to cost you 9 years, she said. The harm was real. It always is when someone lies on a filing. The land doesn't know it was a lie. The grass didn't grow any better because the document was fraudulent. He turned and looked at her. That's a careful way to say something angry, he said. I am angry on your behalf. I'm trying to manage the expression of it. Something shifted in his face. The almost smile she was learning to recognize, the one that never quite reached his mouth, but was entirely visible in his eyes if you knew where to look. You don't have to manage it, he said. Force of habit, she said. I managed most things for 3 years. I'm working on unlearning it. He looked at her for a moment. You can be angry here, he said. That's permitted. She held his gaze. She thought about what that sentence meant, the plain and enormous kindness of it. She had lived for 3 years in a house where certain emotions were not permitted, where her anger was a problem to be solved, her precision was an oddity to be smiled at, her intelligence was something to be displayed on appropriate occasions and put away on all others. She had learned to manage herself with such thoroughness that she sometimes could not find the unmanaged thing underneath. He was offering her permission to find it. "I know," she said, "thank you." He nodded once and turned back to the window and the ridge, and they stood together in the kitchen in the fading afternoon and were quietly and specifically angry on each other's behalf, which is one of the more useful things two people can do together. Delia Marsh came to the ranch on a Thursday in early December. She came without her apron, just herself, a woman in a good traveling coat with her hair pinned up and her hands free, not carrying anything for the household. "I'm going to Denver," she said. "My sister married a man there. She's been asking me to come for 2 years, and I've been finding reasons to stay, and I think it's time to stop finding reasons." Nora looked at her. "When are you leaving?" she said. "Saturday week." Delia held her coffee cup in both hands. "I wanted to tell you directly, not through Emmett." She said his name without fuss, without making anything of it. "I think that's the right way." "I think so too," Nora said. Delia was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something," she said. "I came here after my husband passed because this was where I felt most useful. And Emmett is a good man, and Clara needed consistency, and for a while I told myself that was enough, that I was building something." She met Nora's eyes. "I think I knew before you arrived that what I was building wasn't mine to build. I just needed the arrival to make it plain." She paused. "Be good to them." "I intend to," Nora said. They shook hands. It was the handshake of two women who had been in complicated proximity and had come through it without serious damage, which was more than either of them had been certain of in October. Nora watched Delia walk back toward town and thought Denver is lucky to be getting her. Clara cried a little when she heard. Not much, she had her father's specific compression about emotion, but a little in her room that evening with the door not quite closed. Nora gave her 20 minutes. Then she knocked, waited for the muffled acknowledgement, and went in. She did not sit on the bed. She had learned by now that sitting on someone's bed when they have been crying is an assumption about intimacy that has to be earned before it can be offered. She sat on the floor instead, back against the wall below eye level, and waited. Clara was on the bed with her arms crossed and her jaw set and her eyes recently red, but managing the evidence of it with the stubborn efficiency of a child who considers crying a private thing that has been inadvertently made public. "She was good to you," Nora said. "Yes," Clara said. "You're allowed to be sad she's going." "I know that," Clara said with a fraction of irritation that was actually more reassuring than distress. "You can be sad and still understand why it's the right thing." Clara looked at her, assessing. "Do you understand why it's the right thing?" she said. Nora chose honest over simple because Clara had always responded better to honest. "I think Delia came here because this was the last place she felt close to something she'd lost," she said carefully. "And she was good here. She was genuinely good to you and to your father. But I don't think this was ever quite the life she was building toward." She paused. "I think she knew that for a while before she was ready to leave." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she'll be all right?" she said. "I think she will," Nora said. "She's a woman who knows how to make things work. Denver is lucky to be getting her." Clara uncrossed her arms. "I'm still sad." "You're allowed to be both," Nora said. "Sad and understanding both at once." "I know," Clara said. "I just wanted you to know I understand." Nora looked at this child with her serious face and her rock collection and her 11 years of carefully born understanding and felt a particular kind of love that comes from watching someone be precisely who they are. The love that isn't manufactured, that doesn't require anything in return, that arrives without warning and stays. "I know you do," Nora said. "That's one of the things about you." Clara looked at her. Something moved in her face, the small adjustment of a child receiving something she has been wanting without having known how to ask for it. She didn't say anything, but she didn't ask Nora to leave. They sat together for another half hour, Clara on the bed above, Nora on the floor below, talking about small things and then nothing at all. One evening in the second week of December, Emmett pushed back from the table and said without preamble, "I want to tell you something about Grace." She set down her pen. "Grace was her name," he said. "Allison Grace. She preferred Grace." He looked at his coffee. "I told Clara her mother was called Allison, which was the name on the church register. I told her that because Grace felt like something she had taken with her when she left. So I gave Clara the formal name and kept the other one." He was quiet for a moment. I'm telling you now because I think I'm done keeping it." "What was she like?" Nora said. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Quick," he said. "Very quick. She would have a thought and speak it before she'd finish thinking it, and sometimes the thought was brilliant, and sometimes it was half-built, but you never had to wait to know what she was thinking." He looked at his hands. "I loved that about her at first. It was everything I wasn't. I was slow and deliberate, and she was like weather, like something that happened fast and real and didn't apologize for it." He paused. "The ranch was wrong for her from the beginning. I knew it. I believed she would adapt. But choosing and adapting are different, and I didn't understand that then." "When did you understand it?" Nora asked. "The second winter," he said. "She told me she felt like she was disappearing, that the silence was a physical weight, that she couldn't breathe in a place where the same 20 square miles were all that existed." He looked at the table. "I kept making things, the third outbuilding, the new roof, because making things was how I showed I cared about the life we were building. I didn't understand until too late that she didn't need another outbuilding. She needed a city. And Clara," Nora said. "Clara was 4, he said. Grace offered to take her. I said no." He looked up. "Clara is, she has always been more mine than Grace's in the way that children sometimes land more thoroughly in one parent than the other." He looked at the table again. "I told people she died because I was ashamed. Not of her, of myself, of having failed at something so completely that the honest answer was worse than the lie." He exhaled slowly. "I've been carrying that a long time." Nora looked at him. "When are you going to tell Clara?" she said. "I was thinking," he said, "that I might tell her this week." "I think she already knows more than you think she does," Nora said. "I think so too," he said. "She's been managing me about it for 2 years. I just didn't know that was what she was doing until you said it." She looked at the lamp. "What you just told me," she said, "about Grace, about the second winter, about the outbuilding instead of the city. That was an honest account of what happened without making it anyone's fault and without making yourself the hero of a story where you were actually just a person who made a mistake and then another mistake trying to cover it." She paused. "If you tell Clara that, the actual version, not the performed version, she'll understand. She understands most things." He was quiet for a long time. "I wasn't sure," he said finally, "when you said you wanted to stay, whether you meant it in the practical sense or in the other sense." She looked at him carefully. "In the other sense," she said. Something shifted in his expression. He looked at the table and then at her and then at the table again, and she watched him do the thing she had observed him do 100 times. The careful approach to the true statement by way of the approximate one, trusting her to be paying attention. "You're the first person in a long time," he said, "who I wanted to tell things to, not because I had to or because it was practical, because telling you made the things feel different afterward, more settled, like they were in the right place at last." "Settled is a fine word," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going to be easy to be with," he said. "I know that. I'm slow and I manage myself too much, and I'm not quick with words or gestures." "I know you're not quick," she said. "I've been watching you manage yourself since October. It's one of the things about you." Is that a problem?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what quick had looked like from the inside. Daniel's quick intelligence, Daniel's quick responses, the quick, tidy management of everything she said or did that had turned her into an accessory instead of a person. "No," she said. "Slow is exactly right. Slow I know how to trust." He held her gaze. Something passed between them that was not quite anything yet, but was very clearly the beginning of something. Not dramatic, not declared. Simply the acknowledgement by two careful people who had been moving in a direction and had now confirmed they were moving in the same one. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They went back to their papers, and outside the December wind moved off the mesa, and the windmill turned in the dark, and the stars were brilliant and close and entirely indifferent. And inside the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was steady, and that was enough. Emmett talked to Clara on a Friday evening. Nora was in her own room with the door not quite closed. She could hear the rhythm of the conversation. Not the words, but the quality of it. Emmett's voice low and careful. Clara's responses less frequent than usual, which meant she was listening more than talking. It went on for 25 minutes. Then Clara's door closed, and the kitchen produced the sounds of a man who needs to do something with his hands after something difficult. The coffee pot moved the stove lid open and shut. Nora gave him 10 minutes. Then she went to the kitchen. He was at the table with his coffee looking at the window that faced north toward the ridge. "How did she take it?" she said. He looked up. "She said she already knew," he said. "Most of it." "Yes," she said. "She said she'd known since she was 9. He turned the cup in his hands. "She said she didn't tell me because she was worried about how I'd take it." "She was protecting you," Nora said. "I know." He set the cup down. 10 years old, and she's been managing my feelings about her own mother. "Children learn what the household requires," Nora said carefully. "She learned you needed to be protected from certain things, and she did what the household required. That's not a failure of hers." "It's not a success of mine," he said. "No," she said. "But it's also not the fixed fact you're treating it as. It happened. You know it happened. Clara knows you know. That changes what comes next." She sat down across from him. "What did she say when you told her the whole thing?" He looked up at her. "She said it's all right, Papa. I know you did the best you knew." The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the wind moved off the ridge. "That's more forgiveness than you gave yourself," Nora said. "More than I deserve," he said. "Children are generous beyond what their parents deserve," she said. "It's one of the more remarkable things about them." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was learning to read, the one that contained things he hadn't found words for yet, but was no longer trying to hide from her. "Nora," he said. "Yes." She met his eyes. "She asked if you were going to stay," he said. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I hoped so," he said. "I told her I was working on it." She looked at him, at the lamp between them, at the ordinary kitchen of a house that was becoming, against all practical planning, something she wanted rather than merely needed. "That's a reasonable answer," she said. "Is it enough?" he said. She met his eyes. "For now," she said. "Ask me again in spring." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was learning to read, the one that contained things he hadn't found words for yet, but was no longer trying to hide from her. "All right," he said. "Spring." On a December evening, 6 days before Christmas, a half-grown orange cat appeared at the barn door when Emmett was doing the last feeding. The proprietary composure of an animal that has assessed the available options and found one satisfactory. Emmett brought him to the house, which Nora suspected had required less persuasion than he let on. Clara claimed not to know where he had come from. Nora looked at Clara's carefully neutral expression and concluded privately that the cat had been obtained through some arrangement with a classmate whose barn cat had recently produced a litter. She also concluded that an 11-year-old who had spent 2 years quietly managing the emotional weather of a grieving household was probably entitled to acquire a cat through whatever practical means she found available. She said nothing about the cat's origins. Emmett, who had arrived at the same conclusion by the faster route of having known Clara for 11 years, also said nothing. Clara named him Marshall, she said, after the territorial surveyor who had finally set things right. Because he had a very precise way of looking at things and had decided apparently that the kitchen windowsill was his territory and would not be persuaded otherwise. Nora laughed at that, quickly from somewhere genuine, and Clara looked pleased, and Emmett looked at both of them with the expression she was learning to recognize as his version of happiness, quiet and contained, and entirely real, not theatrical, not performed for anyone, just present the way warmth is present in a room with a good fire. Marshall confirmed his name's aptness by surveying the entire house within 3 hours, designating the kitchen windowsill as his primary territory and the iron box on the shelf as his secondary territory, which he claimed by climbing inside it and going to sleep with the completeness of a creature who has made his decision and considers the matter closed. The formal water rights ruling came on a Thursday in late February. 12 pages of precise legal language. It resolved without ambiguity or qualification that the Faro Land Syndicate's easement filing had been executed with fraudulently altered documentation, that the survey markers had been duplicated and incorrectly registered, and that the North Spring water rights belonged to the Hale property under the original 1871 territorial grant without interruption or qualification. The conclusion was final, not subject to appeal within the territorial system. Emmett read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning while Clara was at school, and the coffee was still hot and Marshall was doing his morning arrangement of himself on the windowsill. He read it all the way through once. Then he set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. 9 years, he said. She did not say anything. She let him have the silence. 9 years of farming around it, he said, keeping the south pasture light because I wasn't certain what rights held up north. Not putting water line to the east meadow because the whole thing felt like it could be pulled out from under me at any moment. He looked at the ruling on the table in front of him. The north meadow. I've never used it the way it should be used. What would you do with it? She asked. He looked up at her. In spring, he said, I'd like to ride up and look at it. What it could be. He paused. I'd like you to come. She understood that he was not entirely talking about the meadow. Yes, she said. I would like that very much. He held her gaze for a moment, steady, warm, unguarded in the way he was becoming more comfortable being in her presence. And then he looked back down at the ruling, and she watched him quietly, without announcement, place his weight on the new reality and find it solid. 9 years, he said again, not with bitterness, with the particular exhale of a man who has been braced for a very long time and is finally carefully allowing himself to let his shoulders down. The formal federal charges against Judge Silas Morrow were filed on a Tuesday in the first week of April. 18 counts across 3 territories: fraud, bribery, theft, from a public trust conspiracy to falsify official court documents, and the manipulation of territorial judicial appointments for personal financial benefit. Each count laid out carefully documented with precision the chain of evidence running from the altered Faro filings all the way back through 11 years of careful, patient, invisible theft. Breck came to the ranch the next morning. She heard the horses in the yard and came out to find him standing at the gate with his hat in his hands. He looked like someone carrying something he was glad to set down. Ma'am, he said, I wanted to tell you personally, the charges are filed. The county's position on the Faro water rights is formally resolved. Any future dispute goes through the territorial court. He paused. Not the circuit. Thank you, Sheriff, she said. He turned his hat twice in his hands. I should tell you, I knew the Faro situation wasn't right. I knew it for 2 years. I didn't know how far it went, but I knew the easement documentation had problems. He met her eyes. I should have moved sooner. She looked at him for a moment. You moved when you could, she said. That's what matters now. He nodded. He put his hat back on. You've done something considerable here, he said. I want you to know I understand that. Several people did something considerable here, she said. I had help. He went. She stood in the yard after the sound of his horse faded and looked at the outbuildings and the corral and the windmill turning in the April morning. The sage along the ridge was coming in, that particular fierce green of desert spring, brief and brilliant. The air smelled like new water and something she had been trying to name for weeks and had finally named possibility. She thought about a woman stepping down from a train in October with an iron box and $418 and a practical plan and no room left in herself for anything beyond survival. She thought about that woman with something close to affection. She went inside. On that same April morning, after Breck had ridden away and the charges had been filed and the desert was putting on its brief, brilliant spring, she went to the kitchen and took the iron box down from the shelf. Marshall relocated to the windowsill without complaint. She held the box in both hands for a moment. Then she set it on the table. She sat down. She looked at it. She opened the lid. Inside, nothing. Empty. An echo of what had been. She had expected this. She had been the one who emptied it. And still the sight of it produced something she had not quite anticipated. Not grief, not relief, something between the two. The feeling of a weight you have carried so long that when it is finally lifted, you are not simply lighter but also uncertain of your own balance. She sat with that for a moment. Then she thought about all the things that had come from the box. Not just the evidence, not just the federal case and the water rights ruling, and Silas's 18 counts. She thought about the letter Daniel had written. I hope it gives you freedom, he had written. She thought about Edmund gathering for 3 years from outside, while Daniel gathered from inside. She thought about Ada Cross at the boarding house table in November. She thought about Clara saying we, without even noticing she'd said it. She thought about all of it, and she understood that the box had not merely contained evidence. It had contained everything that came after opening it. Emmett came in from checking the horses. He saw her at the table with the open box in front of her. He came and stood beside her without speaking. Not filling space with words, but filling it with presence, which was something different and better. They looked at the empty box together. "It's just a box now," she said. "Yes," he said. "When we make this official," she said. She had not said it directly before. She said it now because she was done with imprecision in important matters. "When we file the papers and make the legal arrangement formal, I think I'd like Clara to have the option of Calloway as a middle name. Clara Calloway Hale, if she wants it when she's old enough to decide." He looked at her. "Daniel was not a good husband," she said, "but he gave me the box, and the box gave me the case, and the case gave me this, and I don't want to erase him entirely. I want to place him correctly, in the right size place. Not more than he was, but not less than what he actually did." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "That seems right," he said. "I'll ask Clara." "She'll have opinions," Nora said. "She always does," he said, and something in his voice was warm with it. She looked at the empty box on the table. She thought about placing it back on the shelf where Marshall could have his sleeping spot undisturbed. She closed the lid. She set the box back on the shelf at the far end. Emmett reached past her and straightened it slightly on the shelf. A small gesture. Entirely him. She turned and leaned against his chest, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the kitchen shelf in the lamplight and looked at the empty box, which was no longer the center of anything. "The charges will take years to fully resolve," she said. "Yes. Silas will appeal every finding. Probably. There will be hard days." He held her a little more firmly. "There will be," he said, "and we'll work through them." She looked at the window facing east, which was dark now, but would show her morning in a few hours. The specific light she had come to think of as simply the beginning of the day. "We will," she said. They stood together in the quiet kitchen of a house that was warm and settled into its nighttime configuration, and outside the wind moved off the Cimarron Ridge and turned the windmill in the dark, and the stars came out over the mesa. Enormous and indifferent and brilliant. The same stars she had watched from the train window in October, which had seemed then like things belonging to some other existence, and which seemed now like the sky she lived under. The lamp was lit. The house was warm. Marshall shifted in the iron box on the shelf, adjusted himself, and went back to sleep with the thoroughness of a creature who has made his permanent decision about where he belongs. She was home. She had been running toward this since March without knowing what it was. Running from what she knew, running towards something she hadn't been permitted to name, even to herself. She had carried the box all the way to the Cimarron Ridge and set it down and discovered in the setting down that what she had been protecting was not only evidence. She had been protecting the possibility of this, and she had arrived. In the spring, they rode up to the North Meadow again. All three of them this time, Emmett and Nora and Clara on her small Pinto. The sage was in full bloom along the ridge trail. The sky was that deep, unambiguous blue that has no equivalent in flat country light, the blue of altitude and open space, and a sky that goes on without interruption until it becomes something else entirely. The meadow was greener than it had been in April. The grass had come in along the full length of the spring, new and thick, and the cottonwood stand was full leaf, shaking silver in the late morning breeze. Clara ran ahead to crouch at the water's edge, her boots very close to getting wet, which was traditional, and Emmett walked to the section of the east face where the fence work had been started and stood looking at it with the particular expression of a man assessing the progress of a thing he has planned for a very long time. Nora came and stood beside him. "The east line should be done by end of June," he said. "Tomas's cousin works fast." "He does," she said. "I checked the posts last Thursday. The footings are solid." He looked at her. "You checked the posts." "I like to know the state of things," she said. He looked back at this fence line. Something in his expression was the thing she had been trying to find the exact word for since December, and she had finally settled on it. It was the expression of a man who has been alone for a very long time, and has discovered almost accidentally that he is not alone anymore, and who has not yet finished understanding what that means but finds it entirely good. At the far end where the cottonwood stand thinned and the view opened south, she stopped. The ranch below looked like something she had been moving toward without knowing it. The same careful, maintained intention she had seen from Okafor's wagon on her first October afternoon. The mended fencing, the orderly outbuildings, the windmill turning with the patient steadiness of a thing built to last. It was the same ranch. She was not the same person who had ridden toward it in October. "Emmett," she said. "Yes." She turned and looked at him. She had been thinking about this for months, arranging and rearranging the words because she was a woman who believed in precision and had learned that imprecision in important moments cost more than the discomfort of taking the time. But standing here in the North Meadow, with the spring running cold behind her and the enormous patient sky overhead, the words she'd been arranging fell away entirely. And what came out was simply the truth. "I want you to know something," she said. "Not as a practical report, not as a situation update. I want you to know it because it's true, and because I have spent a great deal of my life not saying true things out loud, and I have decided I am done with that." He waited. He was good at waiting. He had always been good at it. "I was afraid when I got off that train," she said. "I was afraid of everything, of being wrong about you, of being wrong about this place, of wanting too much, and then losing it, of making myself small again to fit inside something that didn't fit." She met his eyes. "I am not afraid of any of that anymore. I am standing on land I consider mine next to a man I have chosen, and I want you to know that the choosing was real. It was not practical arrangement. It was not the absence of alternatives. I have alternatives. I am aware of them. I am here because I am here by choice, because this is where I want to be." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I needed to say it anyway." He reached out and took her hand, simply directly the way he did everything, without ceremony, meaning it entirely. "You're more than workable," he said. She laughed. She could not help it. "Emmett Hale," she said. "You have got to stop saying that." "It's the highest thing I know how to say," he said. "Then I will take it," she said, "as the highest thing." He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips. Not a grand gesture, not performed for anyone, just a quiet and precise acknowledgement of the fact of her. And then he held on, and they stood at the edge of the North Meadow and looked at the land below and the sky above, and the country spread wide in every direction, enormous and patient and entirely theirs. Clara appeared at their shoulders. "If you're done," she said with the serenity of a child who has been monitoring her parents' progress with the thoroughness she applied to everything important in her life, "the horses are getting into the cottonwood." Emmett looked at his daughter. "Which horse?" he said. "Blanco," Clara said. "He's eating the low branches. You know he does that." "I know he does that," Emmett agreed. They walked back across the meadow, all three of them, and the horses and the enormous patient sky overhead, and the spring ran clear behind them, and the sage was warm in the sun, and below, small and solid against the red earth, the ranch waited with its windmill turning and its east-facing window catching the light. Nora looked at it. She thought about the train platform in October and the locked box and the letter that was honest in every single line. She thought about all the things the letter had not told her and all the things she had found anyway, and how the unplanned things had turned out to be the things worth keeping. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere. Then she mounted her horse and turned toward home, and they rode back through the spring morning with the sage in the sky and the red earth spreading out wide around them, and she was not afraid of any of it. "Emmett," she said. "Yes," he said. "We're going to be all right." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ridge and at the ranch below and at the enormous patient country that did not know any of them and did not need to. "I think so too," he said. Above them, the sky held its ancient patient blue. A hawk turned slow and easy on the spring thermals, riding something invisible going nowhere in particular, entirely at home in the open air. They rode until the ranch came up to meet them. Then they went inside.